18-12 and 21-01. Today is November 18th, 2021. It is 1 o'clock p.m. and we are in the conference room 325 for the state capitol, as well as present via Zoom. To my right, I have Representative Linda Ichiyama and Representative David Tarnas. To my left, I have Representative Della Kobayashi, and via Zoom, we have Representatives Mark Hashem, Kyle Yamashita, and I believe Representative Amy Perruso will be jumping on shortly. She's on mute. Ah, there's Amy. Hi, Amy. Excuse me, Representative Perruso is also via Zoom. Members, we are doing our third of 3 ADC-related committee hearings. First up, we have the testimony of Mr. Scott Enright, former chairperson of the Board of Agriculture, and he will be testifying both on the findings and recommendations set forth in report number 21-01, the past operations, management, and oversight of ADC, and the ongoing operations, management, and oversight of ADC. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Enright here, who's very knowledgeable about agriculture, both in his former governmental experience as well as in his current role, continuing to provide great service in the agriculture industry. So because this is a Chapter 21 hearing, I have to ask you to stand up, and this is different from other hearings, and to swear you in. Mr. Enright, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And I'll let the record reflect that Mr. Enright answered that in the affirmatively, and we will jump right into the hearing testimony. So, Mr. Enright, if you could provide some brief background information as a way of introduction to the committee members as well as the public.
Well, you did such a great job, Chair. I don't know that I need to add much more, but Chair, committee members, Scott Enright, formerly a deputy and a director chairperson for the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. And prior to that, I was on the board of ADC and was its chair 10 years ago.
So, Mr. Enright, we have extensive documentation and your name pops up all over the place amongst board minutes, submittals, agendas, and likewise. But if we can start off with the general area of strategic planning, that was a critical area in the audit. And so we wanted to get your thoughts and views on strategic planning of ADC from your perspective, your longtime perspective as a member of the Board of Agriculture.
Well, I guess I'll quote Eisenhower, who said, you know, plans are useless, but planning is everything. So, you know, much like the strategic plan that I worked on with Josh Uehara and Mike Faya to my left for KAA, it needs to be a living document. So, you know, to do a strategic plan, if you don't go back and revisit it on almost an annual basis to adjust, strategic plans fail. You know, they are, as Eisenhower said, useless. And I don't believe there's been a lot of work done to keep any strategic plan current. I've lost track, Chair, I'm sorry.
Sure. So, you know, I mean, the audit in many ways was very ambitious because it covered basically the entire history of the existence of the agency. So if, you know, you were there present and going through many of the issues and saw the evolution of ADC, so maybe we can take this in more bite chunks. Given the agency's broad enabling legislation today, so in today's terms, what would you recommend as things that maybe would help to focus the agency more so that they could have a better strategic planning process? The conversation we've had in this committee is that perhaps the enabling legislation is too broad and maybe it's missed or it doesn't really consider the economic context that we're in today versus when the statute was enacted.
I believe where I'd start with that, Chair, is reminding the board of ADC that it is a development corp. And so therefore there are assets that are in its inventory that, you know, I don't believe should be with ADC. The irrigation ditches, they should be turned over to another entity to manage. More than likely Hawaii Department of Agriculture, because that's not what a development corp does. And then you scale your projects to the assets that you have, your staff and the financing you have. And so basically you take what ADC is currently doing and hone it until you've got something that they can actively pursue. One of the downsides in my estimation for a development corp like ADC is it's board driven. So the ED serves at the pleasure of the board. It's not a political appointee. So, the board elects it. There are ex officios on there, and the governor does get to pick the people that populate the board, but it's not a political appointee. The board can decide whether or not they like the direction that it's going, but it's exceedingly difficult to get quality board members. We're asking individuals, and in reading the audit, which I did at your request because I hadn't until before coming here. They're looking for the board to be very proactive, but you're asking people to volunteer. And there were I thought some excellent choices for board membership at ADC, but they turned it down because they didn't want to release their financials. So we're asking people gratis to come forward and volunteer and be very proactive. And there's very little in it for them except to be second guessed about, the work that they're doing. So it's difficult to get the caliber of people you really need to run a successful development corp.
Okay. So my takeaway from your conversation right now is that really you would really want ADC to focus more on the development aspects of its charge.
I believe that that's where they would be the most effective. And so a case in point might be, my client, KKA Ag Association or KAA. There's no development going on in KKA that's, being done by ADC. So they're overseeing, basically the operations that are being run by KAA. I believe ADC's time would be better spent just focused on development. If the development that the board chooses to do is, say, in central Oahu, where the lands have been purchased and they need to put up post-harvest facilities so that that area would be successful, because with food safety regs, somebody needs to put those facilities up, or at least help the farmers to secure the capital they need to do the post-harvest facilities and to do some chill, because you need the chill. And basically when you centralize that, then you could have entire loads rolling into Cisco or Diotani or some of the bigger wholesalers that would be buying the produce, rather than the farmers themselves either doing it or having paid help drive their loads into town. But that's development. And so, yeah, I believe that time would be better spent doing that.
Okay, thank you. So on this area of strategic planning, I want to turn to members who might have questions, and we'll start off first with Representative Hashem.
No, I don't have any questions, Chair.
Okay, Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to explore a little bit about kind of the issue with board members that are voluntary and really have no upside on this. I know, there's several boards, out there and commissions that get appointed, and we've had to deal with a lot of them. And I'd be interested in your opinion on whether, because I think for a lot of these other boards that I see, part of the issue to me seems to be maybe not a lack of conscientious people who would want to serve and serve well, but it's more the selection process that you choose those that are in the list of those that do what they're told or that are politically favorable to you. Some of the better candidates wouldn't get on the board. Do you think that there's better people that but they're just not offer it up? Or do you think it's in your particular industry here that there just seems to be a lack of people that are really willing to step up on leadership role?
Yeah, I believe it's mostly the latter, Rep.
The latter.
They have
Okay.
the lack of willingness to step forward and do it. And, as we know, right now, government's not viewed well by the general public.
Right.
So, do they really want to step in now? And, the answer seems to be no. And, when I used to look for someone to be a supervisor, when I was working on sugar plantations or other diversified ag ops, I always wanted somebody that didn't want to do the job because it told me they were paying attention, because supervision is like parenting. It's tough. So they were paying attention. They know that, just giving orders isn't what it's all about. So I believe, we as state government, if we really want the best we can get for these boards and commissions, we need to put a lot more work into pursuing that talent. And we put very little into it.
No, it's difficult.
At least when I was involved.
Yeah, I see that a lot on other boards. There's it's hard to get people to do something for nothing and do it
Right.
well. Thank you.
Very welcome, Rep.
Thank you. Representative Yamashita, followed by Representative Tarnas.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for being here, Mr. Enright.
Well, you're my representative. I wouldn't miss an opportunity to be with you.
There you go. I appreciate that. I wanted to see if you had any advice that you could give to the current board as they work to develop a strategic plan, because we understand from talking to the board chair this morning that he's putting together a committee to work on that. We talked briefly about it. I know he's got some people on the board with planning experience. Do you have any advice for them?
Actually, no. Fred Lau is a friend, and he'll do an excellent job. And the board has you're being a planner yourself, the board has a few planners on it. So I think they'll do a good job of coming up with a strategic plan. It's just the keeping it honed. Again, in government, we often put together programs and then we never go back and revisit to see if it still makes sense. It made sense, obviously, at the time the idea was conceived, but if we don't go back and revisit to see if that's really what we want to do, it loses its effectiveness. I think they'll do a good plan. They just have to keep going back and getting other plans. And one of the real difficulties that I see with state government and, is that we do this constant turnover of our decision makers. So every 4 or 8 years, we get another round of individuals who come in to run the different departments. And very often they've got their own ideas about how things are going to go. And, projects that were being pursued get dropped. And, projects that were getting a lot of attention and getting pushed, all of a sudden they're not getting pushed anymore because it's so, it's strategic plan's a living document. So they'll do it and then they just need to constantly be going back and looking and revising it.
Would you
make sense?
Would you say that the lack of data for agricultural products that are being produced here and imported is handicapping their ability to develop a strategic plan that actually is based on reality?
For me, that's a loaded question, Rep. So I'm looking to see where I'm going to dive in on this one.
Okay.
So agriculture is a business. So these are really business decisions that get made as to who's going to invest capital and whether they think they can secure a return on investment. And quite obviously in this state, though there hasn't been that vision that we can make money growing such a crop. So even if you had the data sets, it'll only help so much. It does help. There are, you know, one of our more successful farmers is a gentleman named Larry Jeffs. And, you know, before the pandemic, Larry was probably kicking out 1 million pounds of produce a week, all of which stays in the state. And when I met Larry, when I was a young man on Molokai, he started growing watermelons because he had the data sets that the Department of Agriculture put out. And he realized that he could grow watermelons and have an economic advantage over the melons coming in from the mainland because of the bulk and the weight of that particular fruit. And with that went on to become very successful. So there is, you know, it's helpful, but it's only so helpful. It's not going to get, you know, entities to capitalize agriculture. You know, we've done a really poor job. I don't know that, I certainly know the Department of Agriculture can't do it. You know, it's for the most part, if you look at statute, that's not what they're asked to do for the most part. And ADC is asked to do it, but I don't know that you can really do that successfully. You know, the governor said he wanted to double local food production by 2020. But, you know, I asked him, whose money are we going to use? You know, because we can certainly do it. You know, everyone points to all the acreage that we have fallow and the great growing conditions that we have. And so why aren't we feeding ourselves? Doesn't make economic sense. So, you know, ADC is not going to be able to change that dynamic that much. They can assist, like in Central Oahu, with doing the development so that the facilities are there. So when the agriculturalists do come in, they can be successful. And we've done that in other places, the vacuum cooling plant in our district, Rep. You know, we've done it in different places around the state. There is a role for state government and its different departments, but you know, economic development is a tough business, and we haven't really done a great job of it in this state. There's some things that are easy to sell. You know, we can do tourism. That makes sense, and you know, alternative energy makes perfect economic sense, which is why it thrives. Agriculture to date hasn't. I believe it will somewhere in the not too distant future. We're a water-rich state, especially your home island, their representative, is a water-rich place. And water is the scarcest resource on the planet right now. It's not oil or anything else. It's clean water. And there's all different kinds of ways to do agriculture. But the one common denominator is you always have to have water. Water is an element you can't get away from. And so as we watch California dry up in the Southwest, Mexico is also drying up. And, you know, when we did the free trade pact with Mexico and Canada, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in agricultural infrastructure moved to Mexico because the cost of doing business are so low, and you can just truck it across the border and you're off. You can have it any place in the United States inside of a couple of days by refrigerated truck. That's going to slow up dramatically in like the next 10 years. I thought it was going to take longer, but I think it'll be less. That's when agriculture, that's when we get a competitive advantage in this state, and we'll start growing more of our own. We won't be an export platform for leafy greens, but we can be an export platform for things like mangoes, which is a crop that KAA is honing in on because that particular region on Kauai is excellent for growing mangoes. And we don't grow mangoes in this state, not in any kind of scale. So yeah, I don't see ADC, no matter what the data sets are, what the planning is, that they'll really be able to do a real job of economic development for agriculture. It's too hard of a lift. If, you know, if the legislature wanted to give ADC a lot of capital so that they could co-invest with other agriculturalists that wanted to enterprise, that could probably do it. But, you know, you really got to help them capitalize, because that's how you incentivize somebody to come in. You give them tax credits, and I know that we're not really friendly to tax credits anymore in the building. But that's a tool for economic development.
Thank you for your wide-ranging response.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Appreciate that. Back to you, Chair.
There's so much richness there. Before I go to Rep. Perruso, I just wanted to pick up on the small things though, because we had been talking about planning and staffing, and you had mentioned that, you know, plans are only as good as there's follow-up. So from your perspective as a former board chair, if we could do some targeted investment in staffing for ADC, would a planner be a wise investment for them so that we can keep the focus on moving plans forward?
I would certainly think so, yes.
Okay, and then on the data collection, so again, because of your experience at the Board of Agriculture, we were having this conversation that in 2008, the data collection staffing at agriculture was basically decimated.
Correct.
Again, is that another wise investment? So while yes, maybe data is not everything, is that a wise investment we might make? Maybe not in ADC, so that it's not all on them to do data collection, because like you said, their focus maybe should be business development. But would that be a wise investment maybe for the agriculture side?
Yes, without a doubt.
And then, so I was here in 2008, but I don't actually recall what was the staffing like for the data collection in ag at that time?
I believe they had 6 full-time positions and they had maybe 4 part-time positions. And it was it was the 3rd floor of one of the buildings.
Yeah, and so I don't know that we're going to necessarily bulk up that much.
I don't know that we have to, Chair, because technology has changed so dramatically that, you know, manifesting electronically, if we had the buy-in from the importers, we were working on that when I was at the department to try to get the manifesting in so that we could do biosecurity. Okay. We needed to know what they were bringing in. You know, there's some produce that we never look at really, like mushrooms. And then there's some we always look at, like strawberries. They're a high risk. So you need to know what's in the loads, what's in the 40-foot containers, what's in the air cans, and you need to know it in real time. So I think we could do it with a lot less staffing. There's one of the elements of successful agriculture that's missing in this state is input from the business sector of agriculture. You know, you've touched on sugar and pineapple before when in this committee hearing. And you know, when sugar and pineapple were around, they knew exactly what support looked like from the government, both county and state, and to a lesser extent, the federal government, when I had the former senior senator who could make things happen in Washington. But they could tell, you know, the House Ag Chair, this is what we need, this is what support looks like. We don't have that anymore. But one of the things that I often heard when I was with the Department of Agriculture is they would like to see those data sets again. So yeah, a resounding yes on that. Okay. But you know, the Department of Agriculture is still a rebuild from, you know, 13 years ago, because they cut 40% of the department in one fell swoop. So everybody in that office, I mean, it would have been good if they kept 1 or 2, because yeah, you could have kept some of it ongoing. Everybody left the same day, because when I became deputy, I moved into that 3rd floor. There was nobody else there. And all the calendars stopped on the day that they all walked out the door. They were like bugs. It was like a sci-fi movie, right? Oh, no. It's like, where'd they all go? That was a dramatic change for the department. And my take was, I thought some of the folks that I worked with actually had some form of like post-traumatic stress disorder from having all their cohort just disappear. At that point, they thought they were bulletproof. They went into state government because they thought they'd always have a job. And then they found out, that's not right. Mm-hmm. So, but yes, if we could find the resources to put collecting data back in, and what might be helpful is to bring in a planning group to do a study of what that might look like. So, because it's not going to be what we used to do. It's going to be dramatically different. So it'd be really interesting to see what professionals who understand data collection in 2022 think about what we're attempting to do.
And I'd like us to be prepared for that 10-year timeline that you talk about where we might be able to see a rise in agriculture. I do want to turn to Rep. Perruso. Next question from you on this area of strategic planning.
Sure. So I did want to follow up. I think nationally, there are a lot of conversations around the use of new technology in data collection. And I think that really just to craft some position descriptions, we can look at what our colleagues are doing. I'm not sure that we need to conduct a whole study. I think there is really important work that's being done in that area. I wanted to ask you a different kind of question about the strategic planning. So we've been talking about the power of community-based conversations with that strategic planning process. And I was wondering, as a consultant for KAA, what kinds of issues do you think would surface in that process for that community in talking about a strategic plan for ADC?
Well, one of the asks that we have of the ED and staff at ADC is to look to revise the MOA that exists between Kaha Ag Association, KAA, and ADC, so that more of the decision-making on how that particular farm functions is with the KAA and not with ADC. And when we worked on the strategic plan for KAA, there was input from the community. They have a community, what's Steph's title, Josh? Other than Auntie Steph, what's her official title? So, KAA has retained a community outreach individual who does a great deal of work. And, when we were doing our meeting a couple of days ago, our preliminary meeting, and we were talking about, the different agricultural lists that are currently on the land, much like the ones that you referenced at Whitmore Village, where they came in during, plantation times and were utilizing it. They're attempting, because KAA is a community-based operation. Joshua Ihara, who's the board chair, is born and raised there. That's the first time that we've gotten a local boy to come home and run one of those, anchor tenants that are part of KAA. And Mike Fire's family has been part of KAA Ag for 125 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an extended period of time. So they're all about community. The functions that particular group does, KAA, they keep the town from flooding by doing the dozer work when the heavy rains come. So they're all about tying in with the community. So I would think that would happen when ADC was doing it for your district's sake, because they have so many assets in that district. I would think they would get community input.
So I just, because I was looking for more specificity around the kinds of issues you think are important to that community, because you are working as a consultant for KAA, but then what kind of consulting are you doing?
I didn't catch the last part of the question.
What kind of consulting are you doing for KAA?
For KAA, I worked putting the strategic plan together.
Uh-huh.
And so working with them as they start to implement the strategic plan. Did you get a chance to look at their?
I have,
Yeah.
but I didn't really see the answer to my question, which is what were the issues that the community was the most concerned about? Because I know what the issues are for my community around ADC, and I was looking for that kind of context from your strategic planning process.
So what I would recommend, Rep, if we pose that question to Josh or Mike, who are actually boots on the ground. I'm a Big Island, Commonwealth is where I spend most of my time. So as opposed to individuals that are always in Cape Cod, they would have a much better feel of the community.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Representative Ichiyama? Okay. Any other questions on strategic planning in this area of plans? Members, I do want to point out in the many documents we have, the Keikaha Agricultural Strategic Plan for 2021 to 2024 is in the document, so we do have it in front of us. And I guess for me, one last comment and maybe a question now that you're sitting on the planning side of it, Scott, is, you know, so much of what ADC does, they have so many wide-ranging projects and different lands in their portfolios. And this actually speaks to kind of the struggles of doing strategic planning, is that you have to have plans within plans within plans, right? And so there's plans specific to islands. This strategic plan clearly lays out different goals and objectives. You know, as a former government official, how do you marry or braid all of these plans together? And is that the role that ADC needs to play in helping to kind of weave all of these things together as a development corporation? Or do you think that there's a better way of doing that?
My expectation would be as the individuals, because it's going to be a board creation, you know, strategic planning, it takes everybody's input into account and then, you know, hones that down. I believe they would get to someplace close to what I was mentioning earlier in my testimony, where they start to hone in on really what it is that they can do and want to do and make changes with, you know, basically managing assets, because development corps don't do that. And I don't know that we want them to do it.
So going in a different direction, because this is a conversation we've also had, and we saw that conversation happening in the audit, land banking and the role of ADC as a potential land banker. Do you think that that's also part of its role, or should ADC stop buying lands, even if it might fall into their laps? Should they focus solely on what they have, or should they continue to do land banking in the way that they appear to have been doing it?
You know, I see that as development work. You know, the Larry Jeffs, who I mentioned earlier, was growing watermelons on Molokai. When the sugar companies went out of business, he immediately moved most of his operations to Oahu, because this is where most of the population base of the state is. It's like 85% or better of our population is on this island. This is the market. And so if you don't have to take it down to truck it to Young Brothers and get that extra transportation cost and then, you know, truck it wherever it needs to go, and with the lag time, it puts the neighbor islands at a real competitive disadvantage when they're with whatever they're growing. And we've often heard that you know, because we know Young Brothers wasn't in the best of shape, they just keep raising their rates, which just makes it tougher on ag. So tying up the ag land, I thought was a good idea. Because once that's gone, I don't think you ever get it back. And what most people seem to want is like, you know, the small hobby farms, gentleman farms. And I know that, I've got one, you know, so it's a lot of fun. But it's not real agriculture. And so having that there, and having sort of a critical mass of acreage, which ADC has put together, I think is good work, and gives us the ability to produce more where it's needed here on this island. That said, there's development work to be done, and then that development corp should move on to something else. You know, I don't think we want development corps to be managing assets. So somebody else, you know, Department of Agriculture, I guess, would be the usual suspect. they put it into their ag park and non-ag park programs, and they work with the farmers. And hopefully, you know, it could be a group not unlike KAA. KAA, I've always thought was a great model. It was successful because the anchor tenants came in. You know, there's an amazing amount of resources, financial resources that would need to keep the miles of roads, the miles of drainage ditches, the miles of irrigation piping, the hydroelectric plants, the work that KAA does to run a farm of that size, that, you know, it worked for them. But I believe that model can work, say, in Rep. Perruso's district in central Oahu, where you put it together. And then, you know, the end users are actually managing the assets for the state. And the state's doing some input, but it's not a development corp doing it.
I really appreciate this perspective of development corporation versus management. It's introducing a new set of ideas and thoughts in my head. But on that note, if we could move to the next area of questions, which is really thoughts on specific policies and procedures of the board. It's kind of following this, it's going to be wide ranging. So I'm going to turn it back to Representative Hashem. Do you have any questions on any specific policies, procedures, approaches of the board, of the ADC board for Mr. Enright?
Yeah, like what were you working on before? Previously as the ag chair, you were working closely with ADC. What problems did you guys resolve or had, and that's continuing on today that we should assess?
So I came on, good afternoon, Chair.
Excuse me, Mr. Enright. If you could,
you need to talk into
could
the
you
mic.
speak into the microphone? And he actually will see your image through that camera up there.
I won't say I'm rep, but I'll do what I'm supposed to.
Just so that way, if you speak into the mic, then everybody can hear you.
Sorry.
You're very kind. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I try to be kind these days. I'm older.
That happens. Yeah.
So, Chair, the board of ADC, when I came on with the Abercrombie administration, was actively working on a water development project that never came to fruition. They were looking to put in new hydros and pump storage. They had a very ambitious plan for KAA, but they couldn't get a power purchase agreement with the utility. And so it came apart. The current management of KAA, along with KIUC, the energy co-op on Kauai, is working on a pump storage project now that would take the energy from all the solar that's collected, use it to pump water up the hill to a reservoir, and then release it during the peak time where they can have the energy where they want it. And so that's, you know, it's going to be 10 years ago on December 7th that my buddy Jimmy Nakatani became the executive director of ADC. It's a good time to take a look and review what's going on with ADC, but it took that long for this energy project to get to where it's about to start construction sometime next year. And that was the project they were actively working on, Chair. And also on Kauai, the Kalepa properties, they were working on putting the next landfill on that state land outside of Lahui, which is where that Ahupua'a is, Kalepa. That still hasn't, 10 years later, and it still hasn't come to fruition. But, and like many other places, they keep finding more room in their landfill, but it will run out. So those were the two big projects when I stepped on the board, Chair.
Any follow-up, Representative Hashem? No.
No, thank you, Chair.
Okay, Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. So when we find challenges at a lot of agencies or departments, I've always looked at it as two vastly different types of drivers. I think we have those agencies and departments that are, don't do what they're supposed to do. And then you also have situations where you have kind of mission creep. They do more than their mission is supposed to be, and that waters everything down. And what you've described very clearly is the latter, that they should be focused on development only, and they're doing all kinds of other things. What I found when agencies aren't doing enough, it's when you dig down, there's at its root, more often than not, it's apathy, ignorance, not knowing and not caring. When I look at mission creep, if you will, those that do more than they should, I get a different set of drivers. And the way I come to the answers is really looking at the cui bono, that who's going to benefit from that. And it invariably leads to some moneyed interests that drive agencies to do things that they shouldn't be doing. Maybe a little bit of a loaded question for you, but I mean, what is your opinion on that with regard to the situation of the mission creep here? Do you feel like it's just driven by management's just interpretation of what the mission is, or do you think it's driven by third parties that have a desire to have ADC involved in things that is not consistent with their mission, which, because I see a lot of cui bonos out there, but you can't really connect those dots, but I'd just be really interested in what your thoughts are on that.
The mission creep, I'd hold the position that it comes with your change in your political decision makers. As you go from administration to administration, somebody comes in and believes this is some work that we should be doing that they hadn't been doing previously, and they start programs to move in that direction. Having put enough time into public service, I go out of my way not to critique, because I don't have to, anybody that's taken the time to be of public service. I mean, we can always second guess, individuals' decisions, and hindsight's 20/20. But, they're, for the most part, I see most of them doing it for the right reasons. And they believe that they've got a program, and let's do this. That's where I see the creep coming in. Audits are essential for government. If it's a good audit, it's constructive criticism, which is what I always told the auditor when they came in to do an audit of the, of any of the branches of the Department of Agriculture. And so, and I won't even take a shot at the auditor, but I did it in person.
Right.
I let Les know my critiques, not of this audit, but of the audits that he did for the Department of Agriculture.
Well, it sounds like you understand what the audit process is about, that,
Right.
These are findings and recommendations. They're not criticisms, they're not accusations as it's been framed.
Right.
They are.
When they're done correctly. Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's all done in the spirit of improving things.
Yeah, and the audit should be able to catch that mission creep. Right. This is something that this particular department hadn't done, and now they're doing it. And, is that really what you should be doing with your time and resources?
And that's what the audit report did point out.
Right.
Exactly. And that's what you've raised as one of the largest problems here to be addressed, is working on things that they shouldn't be.
Right. And the apathy, staff sees the world in black and white. They're not decision makers. And if they do make a decision, they're basically putting their butt on the line. Right. So not making a decision is a much safer place to be. So they look and that's not the way I'm interpreting that. And, nothing gets done. And that's where the political appointees, I always stated that my world was gray, because there's black and white sometimes, but there's an awful lot of gray in there for interpretation. especially with our good friends at the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, our world is not so different than that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very much.
Next question from Representative Tarnas.
Thanks. Mr. Enright, I'd like to get your opinion on this issue of redundancy between the Department of Agriculture and ADC. You've spoken to some of that already, that you think certain things that ADC does should be done in the Department of Ag. Right now we've got this 2008 delegation of authority from the Board of Ag to its director to approve ADC projects. I'm interested to try to figure out how to get ADC to improve. That's the whole goal of the audit. That's what our interest is in here. Do you have suggestions on how we might make that more streamlined and a better collaborative relationship between the two? Is that delegation of authority a good thing to continue, for example? And if there's other improvements that you might suggest?
And it's been mentioned in the course of this investigative committee, when they put together ADC when it was crafted in this building to try to assist in creating a diversified agricultural economy with the demise of sugar and pine. They put it on steroids. So yeah, I believe you do want to leave as much decision making. Not that there shouldn't be an overview. There should probably be more overview with, like, say, the Department of Agriculture as to what ADC is doing. But no, I would do that. And you might want to give it back the same language for procurement that it had. During the Lingle administration, that was taken away. So, and that really slows up. There's the current executive director of ADC takes knocks for the land in central Oahu, not having active agriculture on it quicker. But that was pineapple land. And pineapple land doesn't have any irrigation on it because pineapple's a bromeliad, so its water footprint is negligible. You can deliver it by a truck if you need to, which is what they used to do when they put down, chemicals because they couldn't put it through the irrigation. So all of that needs to be taken into account before you start giving out licenses or leases on ag land. But, as I watched, it took years for ADC and its executive director to work through procurement to get what they needed on the ground. So if they were giving more of that delegation, I believe they would move faster, and that seems to be a critique that it took a long time. But having done procurement, the procurement drove me crazy when I was at the Department of Agriculture. Rule of thumb when I was talking to our engineers is if everything goes right, 5 years. And if it doesn't, some number above that, 7 to 8 to get projects done. It's a long process.
So right now, the Department of Ag does help out. I guess some of their engineering folks do help out ADC on occasion. So there's, are there any other sort of collaborative relationships that you think could be enhanced?
The data collection that we were speaking about earlier, I believe that's something you give to the Department of Agriculture. And if ADC and its executive director and its board wanted certain data sets, they could request that of the department. And if it needed some additional resources to do that, they could help supply that going forward. But yeah, I wouldn't see ADC doing that. It's, again, I think it would function better honed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Very welcome.
I skipped over Representative Yamashita. So if he has any questions, he can turn it on his Zoom. Otherwise, I'm going to move to Rep. Perruso for your next question. Rep. Perruso?
Yeah, and I want to follow up on Rep. Tarnas's question, both about redundancies and overlap, but also about kind of thinking about ADC in conjunction with the Department of Agriculture. So I think there's been a lot of criticism of ADC that is more properly targeted towards maybe the legislature, because as you mentioned, we did gut the Department of Ag back in 2008. And I'm wondering, besides data collection, what other functions of the department were really crippled in that budgeting process when we were in an economic crisis? So it's understandable, but then we still seem to be like we are not investing what we should be investing in agriculture, to my mind. So I'm wondering what other functions of the Department of Ag that should be supporting the work of ADC and other kinds of agricultural work should we go back to and revisit?
You know, I was trying to figure out how to go at that one, Rep. To a great extent, the work of the Hawaii Department of Agriculture is regulatory. So, you know, we do the work of the EPA for pesticides. So, you know, that's, you know, to the extent that there was any work that needed to be done for ADC about, say, pesticide usage, which I know is a concern that this committee has touched on over the course of time. That's the work of the Department of Agriculture. And it should be requested by the board and the executive director for ADC as to what they might want, and that work can be done. Land management, engineering, you know, so just about every function that the Department of Agriculture has, there's overlap work that could assist ADC work coordinated better.
Okay, and so that leads directly to my second question, which is, you know, there has been a lot of conversation about what functions are best performed by ADC and which are more appropriately performed by the department. And you talked about management, but specifically you talked about water system management. Do you also think that that's the case with land management? And do you think that ADC should stick to agribusiness development? Because there's a difference between development and then management, right?
Right. It's, you know, I guess I could use how it could potentially be modeled in your district with the land purchases that happened in central Oahu. Right now, they really are in development. Those pieces, you know, reservoirs need to be built, irrigation needs to be built, roads need to be put in. But at some point, that and all changes, and before it changes into management, there should be a phase where you bring in the Department of Agriculture so that they understand what they're going to pick up in resources. Now, I know my friends at the Department of Agriculture, if they're listening to this, sorry, Brian Cal, because, you know, they don't have the resources to do the work that we're asking them to do now. So asking them to take on more without really taking a look at how these systems are run. You know, the irrigation systems and how they're run in this state are a mess because we don't price water correctly. You know, we do one fell swoop, 52 cents for 1,000 gallons every place in the state. It costs us more to move water in certain districts. And, you know, we need to get water pricing down. That's the work of the Department of Agriculture. They should be allowed the latitude to do that, and they're not given that latitude. And yes, I believe, Rep, that, you know, those management, when it passes from development to where you're managing an asset, it passes to another entity. And the likely suspect, sorry, Brian, because I know you're listening, it would be Agricultural Resource Management Division inside the Department of Agriculture.
Thank you. And I think that Chair Shimabukuro had had a similar response. But I also really appreciate your comment about water pricing, because this is a question I meant to bring up with Mr. Manuel yesterday. And it's such an important discussion, and I could not agree more. So thank you.
You're very welcome, Rep.
Representative Ichiyama. I have a question on actually going back to Mr. Rep Hashem's question about what issues were kind of top of mind when you were board chair with respect to ADC. And one of the things that, again, because, and we have Kauai here because we were very concerned that that was omitted from the audit. And we came across public documents about the conversations that were happening at your time because some of the seed corn companies in the KAA Association were abandoning, and I don't know if that's the right term to be using, abandoning lands, they were giving up acreage. So it seems to me we're actually at a point in our economic history, our agricultural history, where we may actually be seeing a shift, right, in agriculture, and that the ADC could be helpful in helping that transition if we are in fact going through a transition now. And so I guess I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you saw as some of the challenges and opportunities with these changes that we saw happening in KA at the time, like in 2016, 2017. And are we addressing those changes appropriately right now? And I know you kind of wear two hats because you now work for KAA, but if you could really look at it and explain to us from your position when you were board chair, what were some of those concerns you were dealing with and what we should be looking at as the state entities?
Okay. Yeah, the concerns back then were the accusations that were being made about the, the agricultural practices that the seed corn companies were using on West Kauai. And there was, there was an amazing amount of concern because the accusations were that the lands were being abused, that the companies, the seed corn companies, the biotech companies were applying pesticides like 10 times the rate. They were applying experimental pesticides, that they were killing fauna and flora, and there were cancer clusters. I mean, it was a long and horrific list of things, of accusations that were made about the company's practices. And that's why you had the largest protest march in the history of Kauai. But when we did the joint fact finding and went in with a science-based investigation into those practices, none of those things could be substantiated. So it was an interesting process. Including working with the federal government and this, Center for Disease Control on whether there were any cancer clusters or birth defects. And I mean, these were some of the claims that would be made publicly. And the Department of Agriculture, because we do that work for EPA at the pesticide branch, needed to substantiate whether any of that was in fact the case. And again, even with the, the part of the joint fact-finding group that thought that the seed corn companies were suspect on some of their practices, two of them were physicians. So they did have a very strong science-based background, the group that was put together by Accord 3.0. And they thought they were going to find these things. They were sure. And they were supposed to have a bias, that this is going to be the case. And again, none of it could be substantiated. What they did want is more oversight by basically state government. There were recommendations, there were over a dozen recommendations for the Department of Agriculture, there were recommendations for the Department of Health, there were recommendations for the Department of Education, for the County of Kauai. So the group came up with a long list of recommendations to get more data. so that they could look to see if they could substantiate anything going forward. And over the course of the time that I was at the Department of Agriculture, we came to this lovely square building and asked for, financing to implement some of the recommendations. And so every year we were doing some of the implementing these different recommendations.
Sorry, Mr. Turner, I have to interrupt you. I wanted you to more focus on,
Yeah,
I understand the controversy around pesticides, and I do hope that, I know that there are some interest about the joint fact-finding committee investigation, but I was actually more interested in the land management, knowing that some of the seed corn companies, and not with, I don't think it's related to issues of pesticide, but more just the economies, the global economics of agriculture. So my understanding from the public record was that you were looking at questions about what happens as land is abandoned or released back to ADC. I was more interested in the land management questions.
I didn't miss that part, but it was the way you phrased the question, what was I working on? That's what I was really working on.
Understood.
It's market share. The change, and this would be a good one for Joshua, because this is his area of expertise, but for the Department of Agriculture, when I looked at it, we used to grow rice out in Cape Cod, and then it was sugar. And when sugar was there, the corn companies were already on the west side of Kauai. They've been doing seed genetics on Kauai for over 50 years. Came in with Jim Brubaker, the genetics professor from UH Manoa. Rest in peace, buddy. So it's market share. All of those companies jumped in. They're a bunch of small, 100 seed corn companies. And then, Monsanto bought some, and Dow bought some, and Pioneer, which was always on the west side of Kauai, were buying them up, and BASF, the big German chemical company. And so they bought these small genetics firms and folded them into their ag portfolios. Those Lee lands with water are the best lands for any kind of agriculture. But these companies had the wherewithal to buy them, because they were large, well-funded operations. And so they expanded their footprint. With market share, when they realized that they're not all going to make a lot of money, they, just like any other startup industry, whether it was cars or computers, and, we've seen the same thing. Some drop out, others get bought up, and, we land up with a bunch of small ones, like Mr. Uehara is with Hartong Brothers out of Madison, Wisconsin. It's a family-owned company, but they're not doing the work like Monsanto to get genetics that are going to grow in Asia and Africa. They're just honing genetics for the Midwest, or the upper Midwest, I believe. So that was anticipated that there would be companies dropping out. And it's crisis and opportunity, right? So they had it, they tied up, they had the land tied up, which was a good thing, because we didn't have anybody else that wanted to come in and farm it. And now that they've reduced their footprint, it gives an opportunity to grow diversified ag. And we'll see what's next. And I go back to my comment about water sources, because there are rich water sources on Kauai. And so you're always going to be able to do agriculture. And then I think we're going to find certain crops that do really well in Keika, and we'll get more diversified agriculture.
So on that note, we're not going to lose you, Mr. Enright, but I'd like to take a short 5-minute break, and we're going to move Mike and Josh into the hot seat, and then have Scott to the right of them. And so we'll come back in 5 minutes. Recess. reconvening our meeting or our hearing for the House Investigative Committee. Today, this afternoon, we have joining us Mr. Joshua Uehara, Board Chairperson of the Keikaha Agricultural Association, and Mr. Michael Faya, Manager of the Keikaha Agricultural Association. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. We'll jump right in with swearing in for your testimony. If you could please stand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. And let the record show that they answered that in the affirmative. So by way of background and self-introduction, I ask that Mr. Uehara, you start first, followed by Michael Faya, just to introduce yourself to committee members as well as the members of the public. Mr. Uehara.
Thank you, Chair, member of the committee.
And you're welcome to take off your mask while we're speaking, if that's more comfortable.
All right, Joshua Uehara, President of the Keikaha Ag Association, also Vice President, General Manager of Heart and Quality Operations. As Scott mentioned earlier, I'm born and raised on Kauai. I grew up in Waimea.
And Mr. Michael Faya.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. My name is Michael Faya. I'm currently the manager of the Keikaha Ag Association. I also have been a lifelong resident, well, pretty much all my life in Waimea. I was born there and returned there. Just some background. My first job was the Hokilepo gang for Waimea Sugar Mill Company at 15 years old. After UH, I was a systems analyst for American Factors, signed to Pioneer Mill and then back to Ligui Plantation and Keikaha Sugar. Then in the intermediate years, I did manage the land, the family lands in Waimea. And when the sugar leases were expiring, I began putting corn, seed corn on the property because I just saw that as a future. And since then, I've been developed Waimea Plantation Cottages, for example, and had a construction company. Then in 2018, I was hired by Keikaha Ag Association as a manager. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you both for joining us here today. You know, one of the reasons that we've asked and focused in on the Kauai lands is that in our investigation and the follow-up in this audit, you know, learning about the challenges, the ongoing management, the past management operations and oversight of KAA has come to our attention as, you know, part of what ADC might be doing on the Galbraith lands. And just so for us to also just understand the wide range of things that ADC has done. So for the questioning during this part, and my goal is to still finish at 3 o'clock, so we have a full 45 minutes with you on the hot seat. Members will be just asking a broad range of questions related to all of those things that I spoke, all of the above. You know, both your relationship with ADC, what's worked, what hasn't, what's been challenging, past operations and ongoing operations management and oversight by ADC. So it's going to be kind of wide ranging, and I know you folks are well equipped to answer any questions. And we're going to start off first with Chair Tarnas.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you both for being here today. Appreciate it. And I'll ask the broad question and request your opinion on what has worked well with ADC and what could be improved upon.
I think actually, for the most part, I would say it's been a really good relationship working with ADC. They've been very open-minded. They've been very flexible with us in understanding when we bring issues to them. They've also been extremely open to suggestions we may have, or ideas for prioritization, or what we think would be appropriate use of the property, or how we think we should tackle a given problem with the property. So I would say in general, that's been a really good, we can always give them a call or take the time to visit them and have a discussion about what we think needs to happen, and that's generally worked really well for us. I would say the part of the challenge, but I think this is just inherent actually in the challenge of managing a property like that, is it does take a lot of time and energy, right? So the running of the co-op, keeping track of the issues, managing all the associated projects, managing all the associated ongoing issues, whether legal or logistical or operational. Those are a huge requirement for resources, capital resources, just time and energy, expertise. So over the years, we were fortunate, as Scott mentioned, at various times we had anchor tenant companies that had, a very, very deep bench of resources, whether that would be engineering expertise, subject matter expertise, legal expertise, and resources or capital as may be required. And so while we've been granted a lot of flexibility to deal with the issues, it did take a massive amount of resources that, without the benefit of the specific types and members that we've had, would have, made the challenge a lot harder to address. So as far as anything specific to ADC, I would just say, maybe if there are a way for the agency to provide more of the resource and horsepower in some of those areas, that would have definitely been helpful, but I'm not sure how you balance that with the flexibility, right? So keeping more of that resource on our side of the fence, let's say, made sure we were able to react very, very quickly. As Scott mentioned previously, the procurement requirements, that the ADC is subject to as an example. And when you're operating a ditch system, you can't wait 5 years to fix a problem, right? Even if it happens to be a capital problem where you're going to have to spend, 6 figures plus to address the issue, you may need to address it that week or crops are going to die. So there have been areas like that where we say, okay, well, it would be nice if, ADC could help with some of these problems, but I don't know that, a state agency, if you will, would be able to do that in any circumstance. So while that may be sort of wishful thinking, I think even though they have been challenges, we've been able to work them out pretty well.
Michael, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think Josh covered pretty much most of it, but having grown up in the sugar and Big Five kind of environment, I kind of see it pretty close to the same way, where the individual plantations were managed independently, but you had Mother AmFac back home to pull in the big bucks when needed. As you know, all of our operating costs are paid for by the members. It's not any state money. But when it comes to long range projects that are going to be 50 years in life, such as a major ditch upgrade or a hydroelectric upgrade, the ability for us to discuss our needs or our goals, our dream list sometimes with ADC, and as Josh said, with the horsepower that they can bring to it, it gives us, generally will be able to, ADC will be able to provide us with the capital that's needed to, develop that project.
So for the longer term, or for these larger projects that would take too long for you to amortize, just because it takes, your land tenure is not that long, right?
That's exactly it. So it's going to go beyond the term of some of these leases, and it's all state property and state assets. So they're able to bring in funding for those kinds of projects. But the quick ones like Josh has just mentioned, where we needed to spend 6 figures. It was the incident recently occurred in the end of August, and by the beginning of November, the job was completed. But we used our funds in that, our internal funds for that work.
Thank you very much. Let me turn it back to you, Chair.
Okay, I don't see Representative Hashem, so we'll go back to, Representative Kobayashi. And then we'll follow that with Representative Yamashita, who's joining us. Go ahead, Representative Kobayashi.
No questions, Representative.
Okay, Representative Yamashita?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Is Mr. Enright still in the room?
We can hear you, Representative Yamashita.
Yeah, but is Mr. Enright still in the room?
Yeah, yes, Scott Enright is still here in the room.
Yeah, okay. This question is kind of addressed to him. Follow up from the previous conversations and in light of what we just brought up. Earlier there was a discussion about land banking, and you mentioned that you thought it was a good idea, but at the same time, from the state's perspective, sometimes it's very difficult to, with very limited resources to be all things to everyone. And, with the needs of agriculture and their infrastructure needs and all those different things. With what Chair Tarnas is working on with Act 90, and there are agricultural lands that could be diverted to ADC to work on, and that actually need help and could use the expertise of ADC or something like that. Don't you think that's a better way of using state resources instead of us spending money on acquiring more land when the state already has land that could potentially be turned over to ADC?
You'll have to excuse me, Rep. Good to see you again. Your audio wasn't that good, and my hearing's not that great either.
Okay.
So didn't quite catch the question. Sorry.
Okay. I'll go get a little closer. Does it help?
Thank you.
Okay. So if with the limited resources of the state, right? And you talked about spending money on banking more land. Wouldn't it be better with all the needs of agriculture infrastructure, and not to mention the state has other needs also, education, housing, and all these different things, right?
Right.
Everybody's tugging at the same pot of money. Would it be smarter for us to look at the lands that Chair Tarnas is looking at right now with Act 90 to get those lands turned over to maybe ADC and working on it that way? Or my concern is that at the end of the day, the pot is only so big and everybody's tugging at it. And there's other ways that the state can support ag, and ADC can use their powers and their expertise to support other state lands. Don't you think that'd be a better way to use our resources?
The potentially, as an Aggie, I just liked the idea of grabbing the land when it was available. I was never sure whether the state, whether that's really where we wanted to spend the resources. But it seemed to pass through finance and ways and means, and so we did it. I wasn't sure if that was going to continue with the limited resources that we have for government. So these are, to a great extent, as it was mentioned earlier, Rep, the agriculture is a business. So does the state really want to jump in, because we're securing the land for smaller businesses? The bigger businesses will go out and buy the land themselves. But the small guys, in a state where the average home price on Oahu is going to be $1 million, any startup agriculturalist, they can't get in, they can't buy the land. So somebody's going to have to lease it to them. Landowners would much rather sell a 2-acre parcel to somebody like me to put up, as we do on Maui, put up, nice homes and have some acreage around you. So, that's a decision that you folks get to make here about whether this is where we want to spend our limited resources. I wasn't sure at all that it was going to continue.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that, because at the end of the day, right, sources are very, very limited, and to adequately support agriculture and other entities that the state has responsibility for, we've got to be very strategic. And I think I think a lot of people may look to you for advice on those things. So I believe that getting a clear understanding of right, you were the state director and you sat on ADC and, you know, you worked in the private sector and you understand economics and things like that. So I think we just got to be a little more strategic. So, you know, what you say has influence or has some bearing on some people. And I think that's why I'm just suggesting that you be a little cognizant of those types of things.
Thanks for the question, Rep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rep. Yamashita. So next up is Rep. Perruso.
Yeah, so my questions have to do with the land. Hi, Mr. Faya. And this question is for Mr. Faya and Mr. Uehara. My questions have to do with the lands that are not currently part of KAA's co-op, but are part of the Kekaha ADC lands. And so by my estimation, and also according to your own PowerPoint presentation, only about 53% of the available lands, the tillable acreage, is being cultivated. So I was wondering, and I know that there's a plan for the 500 acres for smaller diversified agriculture, but I was wondering if you have additional plans to reach out to small farmers who may not be able to farm 100 acres, but could farm some other part of that remaining, what seems to be like more than 4,000, almost 5,000 tillable acres.
Yeah.
Or if that's ADC's job. So my question is really like, do you see yourselves as developing that land? Is that your kuleana, or is your kuleana simply to manage the lands that are part of the co-op property? Or does that make sense?
Yep. So I guess maybe to clarify one point up front. So there's a difference between the lands that are licensed by the members of the co-op versus the lands that are served by the infrastructure that the co-op manages. So the co-op manages the infrastructure that serves all of the land, whether or not the lands are under license currently or licensed to a co-op member versus a non-member subscriber. So maybe that would clarify some of the context. Currently, it's not our responsibility, but it's something that we take on, you know, proactively. Even in doing our strategic plan, that's not sort of strictly speaking our responsibility, but we just said, you know, somebody has to do it. We think it needs to happen. It's in the best interest of the property. It's in the best interest of agriculture and the members and other agriculturalists, non-member subscribers. So we'll take that on. We'll take a shot at it, basically. And so the plans that we currently have are sort of what we think is sort of the first phase of what we think needs to be done and that is feasible to actually do. But ultimately, yes, we do want the entirety of the property to be in production if possible. And we're looking at, you know, different ways that can happen. There are different issues that have to be resolved for different potential use cases. So one way you can put land into active use very quickly that sort of maintains the quality of the land to a certain extent if managed properly would be livestock, for example. But there are issues with livestock in terms of potential runoff from the livestock operations, even if they're low density. So if there are goats at low density, if there are even low density cattle or horses, strictly speaking, you need a set of best management practices about how to manage those things. That all of that needs to be in place along with sort of a rule framework agreed with Department of Health on how you're going to manage all of that. So those are things that we're sort of working on in the background, but we realize those things are going to take a long, long time to get finalized. And so we realize there's demand for that. There's a, you know, for at least for the lands that are unoccupied at the very least for a period of, let's say, midterm 5 to 10 years, there are lands that realistically are probably not going to be in intensive ag production of crops. It would be great to put cattle on there or something because then at least you keep it from getting overgrown. And we've mentioned a few times about, once land gets overgrown, that becomes very, very expensive to restore. So it can be a way to sort of bank and hold the land for potential future, even higher value ag operations while being productive in the immediate term. But there are those hurdles again to those things. So those are all things that we've talk about constantly. We think about in the plan are sort of what we think, are things that are actionable in the near future.
Thank you. And can you also share with the committee some of your thinking around, and it's been discussed in this committee at other times, but Kauai as really the breadbasket of the whole state, because you have such amazing capacity, and also I think water is plentiful, and that's really critical to farming. So when you think about shipping and transportation of goods to the other islands, and in particular to Oahu, I know we've had multiple conversations about subsidizing young brothers and for the sake of facilitating and lowering the costs of that shipping. Is that something that, can you share with the committee any work that you're doing in that area, or any thoughts that you have on what the state can do to facilitate that?
Yeah, certainly. So that actually is something that factors heavily into our discussions and into our planning sort of implicitly. And that gets to some of the discussions that we frequently have about crop suitability and critical mass and scale, economic scale. Because on Kauai, as Scott mentioned, 85% of the population of the state's here on Oahu, by implication of much, much smaller percents on Kauai in particular. So your market is sort of bifurcated between on island is a vanishingly small market in terms of meaningful economic scale. You can grow all the mangoes that everybody can eat all year round in probably 20 acres on Kauai. But to make it worth shipping those mangoes to even Oahu, let alone, exporting beyond the state, you probably got to get to 80 plus acres. So there's a massive gap in between where if you grow 50 acres of mangoes, you're not growing enough to ship economically, but you're growing way too much for the island. You're going to crash your own market. So that just doesn't work. And that's part of why you see that disparity between Kauai with the natural resources to be a breadbasket for the state, and yet it being so difficult to catalyze that economic development to realize that potential, because you have to immediately jump to that minimum scale to be able to get produce off the island. And that takes a logistics chain that requires specific expertise around the crop. It requires specific types of infrastructure, significant capital investment on the production side, all of those things that have been discussed earlier, I think. So
but my question is really, let me be a little bit more pointed. My question is really, wouldn't that cost barrier be lowered if the state subsidized shipping costs for the sake of food sovereignty?
It definitely would. And so I guess I was going to get to that point is there are different things the state could do to incrementally lower that barrier to entry so that, let's say, a 20-acre farm is viable versus having to go immediately to 50, or the 30 or 40-acre farm is viable. So that sort of lowers the bar. The interesting thing is, though, you might want to do that tactically, from my perspective, so that the industry can get started, but you also don't want to start an industry that can only ever survive, even once it reaches scale, if those subsidies continue, right? And so that is a challenge, is you want to get it started, you want to get that engine turning, but then you want to make sure that it's something that you're building that has a path to self-sustainability, if you will, because it's a different matter if you start something that scales that fundamentally is also going to require a scaling subsidy. Is that something the state can continue indefinitely? Probably not.
Right.
That I think is the challenge. I think the answer is tactically yes. You want to do that. I would appreciate if that's done. We're starting to grow alfalfa for feed, and we're actually developing customers here on Oahu and even Maui. We've shipped some alfalfa for cattle operations there, and something like a subsidy with Young Brothers would definitely help that business. But we only ever started that business thinking that once it gets to sufficient scale, that it would be self-sustaining, because otherwise, that's going to be ultimately a dead end, and you don't want to realize that you're at a dead end when you're $20 million and 10 years into a business. So it's
right. And I think, yeah, that aversion to dependency is really important. So then my final question, Chair, I'm so sorry, but are you having conversations with private entities? So I know that Hartung is operating both privately and on ADC property, but then are you having an island-wide conversation around these kinds of production and transportation issues and developing collaboration around those?
Yeah, actually, we're very fortunate on Kauai that we're a very tight-knit community, both in general as well as in the ag sector. So we have a few organizations. The Kauai Economic Development Board is a key one. We have the Chamber of Commerce as well that has an ag committee. So we'll get together and try to address some of these concerns that really pertain to ag on Kauai as a whole. In those types of venues, we share concerns on input costs. Conversations in the past with Fred Call at Kauai Coffee as an example. He's on A&B land. With GNR, we frequently look at how could their lands be put into production economically, what are potentials there, because all of those things help all of us basically, right? If at the very least, even if we don't share the same end market, bringing in fertilizer or other materials required to run our operations, that gets cheaper for everybody if there's more skill there. So that's something we talk about constantly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Perruso. Rep. Ichiyama? Thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. I was wondering if you could speak to what I hear is a huge challenge in the egg industry is workforce. Where's the next generation of farmers going to come from? And if you could speak to that experience in Hawaii. I'm so happy to hear that you are from Hawaii and return home to work there, but do you see that similar experience happening for your classmates, and how do we grow our own, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a key issue. So I'll speak to some of the experience with my particular company, because that's where I can provide the most detail. So that was one of the critical strategic issues when Hartung Brothers bought the operations in Hawaii initially in 2017. And we immediately took the minimum wage for full-time employees to $18 an hour, because we had looked at a MIT study that said, that was the minimum livable wage for a single person, at the entry level on Kauai. So that was a substantial raise actually for our lowest paid full-time employees. And we've been strategically taking steps ever since to try to address that, whether it's raising the wage of seasonal employees. I think we're at minimum above $15 an hour at this point, even for our minimal seasonal pay. We even bought a beach house to house seasonal migrant workers, because even with trying to make our pay as competitive as possible, we haven't been able to bring in enough seasonal people for our peak season. We end up having to go to H2A labor out of Mexico. That thankfully we're familiar with those operations because we work with them in the Midwest as well. They actually cost in total, I think it's over $40 an hour for those employees all in, once the expenses are done. So we're not doing that to bring in cheap labor. They're actually far more expensive than any local labor that we could find. It's just we can't find the people. So we're trying to look at, what are the key challenges there. One is definitely housing, is one I'm sure you're going to hear everyone talk about. Even just getting people interested in agriculture. So we're heavily involved in internships. We run internships every year for high school and college students. We're involved in I think the Department of Education is doing an academies program to try to, develop career pathways for, exposure for students into different career pathways. We're involved in that. So we try to take these strategic measures to address what we know is just going to be a persistent issue, essentially indefinitely at this point. I think those are things that are going to take a lot of thought and strategic planning from the state's perspective on how do you want to prepare people growing up here in Hawaii to pursue careers that are viable here in Hawaii. What are those careers going to look like? How are people even going to get exposed so they realize that it's even an option for them to do that? Because one of the things that we hear consistently from student interns that we bring in is gee, I didn't know anybody did that. Whenever I hear farming, I have a certain picture in my mind. This is nothing like that. Whether it's the skills you need, what your day-to-day operations look like, what kind of pay, and benefits are potentially available. There's just a completely different picture that most people have as to what that looks like versus, the reality, at least for farm companies like ours or some of the other members of the co-op. So how to address that, I wish I knew. We're trying everything though.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Mr. Faya, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think, labor in Hawaii has always been a problem of attracting labor. The Hawaiian government in the 1880s had an office of immigration trying to find people compatible, and that's why many of us are here, I think. And then they had camps, they set up the housing and the medical and everything for the people. It's kind of moved as it has moved, it's shifted. A lot of that stuff that individual companies did got shifted to the government, has taken over those roles. So, and one of the gaps I think that we have on ag land, and this is on the state ag land and as well as private land for ag, is the farmers can't live, the small farmers can't live on their land. So we expect them to drive from someplace far away, tend to their crops, and then drive home as opposed to living on the land with the back 40 being the garden, or their farm. We don't have that model in Hawaii, and this is zoning laws and just land practices. We don't want to see individual cesspools and things like that. That is hard. And looking at our property, the Kekaha property, do we bring back a couple camps, quote unquote, a modern version of the camp on it, where we had villages at one point, and these become it becomes a farm worker community, and they're living near to the land. So that, I think, that's one avenue. Another avenue I think we're seeing is some of the resurgence of cultural interests and cultural farming, i.e. taro primarily, where we have graduates coming out of Hawaiian studies and tropical ag, where they want to return to some of their cultural practices. And in fact, there's a gentleman in Waimea who gets water off of our system that brings high school students in, and they grow taro and they process it. They have their own mill, a taro poi mill. So do we look at those people and bring them in? They're interested. He's expressed interest in taking 50 acres on the property, but the next question is can we live there? Can we have at least something more than just the fields? And one of the reasons it's taking long to get our 500-acre Waiaka Farms concept launched is we're threading the needle with how do we get some of those kinds of attributes into the farm and still meet all the legal requirements and management requirements that it's going to take to to have that kind of stuff on the land. I think those are the two, other than what Josh is talking about, is or to add to what Josh has said.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair. I want to go in a different direction as I'm taking a look at the restated memorandum of agreement between ADC and KAA. It has been suggested that a tenant association may be the way to go for Galbraith lands, and people have pointed to the KAA as a good example of a co-op. But can you explain for the public, maybe, because we're throwing these words around, the association really is a co-op that manages, maintains, and operates the water infrastructure. Is that a correct characterization of the work that you folks do?
It's a partial characterization.
So, yep, yes, please educate us.
Sure. So we also manage the, or I should say Mike manages the roads and the security for the area, and working with the community on fire prevention when you have all of this, potentially dry land, all kinds of other community issues as far as, people poaching on the land or stealing crops on the land. So there's sort of a wide-ranging area, I guess, in which we're involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that model has matured over time, or did you start with that when the lands got transferred from DLNR to ADC?
I guess I would say, well, first the RMOA itself wasn't something that we had in place right off the bat, right? And so it's the product of long discussions between the tenants of the property and the ADC on just trying to figure out how is this supposed to work? Because one of the things in Kekaha, and maybe Mike can speak to some of this in more detail if you want, all of the infrastructure, even the way the town is built, it was all designed around the concept of one entity managing all of it, is because it was a sugar plantation, right? So they managed all the water coming in the irrigation system. They managed all the water leaves the plain on the dewatering system and the drainage canal system. They managed, all of the back road network for the area. So it was never built to facilitate multiple small tenants that are completely disconnected from each other or anything. So because of that, it became very clear that how do you have, let's say, two at least nominally competing companies manage each their own part of the infrastructure, because one guy is downstream from the other guy, and why would one person bear all the cost of sections of the canal that maybe is really to benefit other people, all those types of issues. So it became clear very quickly we needed something like a co-op, and then it was a matter of hammering out with ADC, within the context of Hawaii statute and ADC's mission and the interests of the tenants. What does that kind of agreement look like? What does the organization start to look like? So I would say it's been a ever-evolving process, really. The RMOA is sort of a milestone document where we codified things that needed to be codified at that point in time, and then we continually work with ADC on what are other things we should address. What are we in a better position to address than, because we're boots on the ground, as Mike would say. I don't know, Mike, do you have anything the past few years?
To add to that, Josh is, as you can see, very thorough, a very good representative for the Kekaha Ag Association. I think what has evolved, what has to be understood that makes the Kekaha Ag work, the model work, is we do have these anchor tenants that can write big checks. The process that we go through, and we'll be taking this up in a week, on Tuesday coming, is the KAA develops a budget for the coming year, operating budget for the coming year, and basically what you do is you take that budget and you divide into the tillable acres, and the companies pay, both the member companies and non-member companies. So, there's and everybody has to pay, and fortunately, we don't have to spend a whole lot of time chasing money. The checks come at the beginning of the month, and we don't really have, even with the small people, we don't have a problem collecting. I think when you go to a Galbraith situation or someplace outside of what the exact model that we have, that has to be looked at real strongly. It's been said, to make a co-op like this work is the members have to want it. The members have to need it. Like Josh said, you got these chunks of land, and you have to manage it collaboratively, because the guy, the end of the 30 miles of ditch, i.e. Hartog, they need the water just as bad as, Corteva up here at the beginning part. So, and we need to balance security. We need to make sure the roads out there are clean, and it's all shared. Yeah, I mean, it's because they use a little bit more water or their roads are a little bit more bus up. That doesn't mean that they're going to get charged more, unless of course their equipment runs into the gate and stuff like that. But so I think the operation of the land, how it's going to work, has to be studied well, and not just take our model and cookie cutter it, into the next property. And then I think the other thing too is that, as Josh said, we have a good relation. The island is small, and everybody has to support each other, and particularly on the west side. And so we have a really big advantage out there, of that, because of that. And so everybody is going to try to work together. There's going to be a heated issue. The community comes together and tries to work it out. And I'm not saying it works out easily and peacefully every single time, but I've been involved in community things out there for a long time. And, a lot of times, if we have a difference, we pull back and try to work for the better good of all. And I think that is another important component or fortunate component that we have, in Kikoha.
I really appreciate how you talk about the context, because I think you're right. It's not easily transferable. And I really worry that we don't have the large anchor tenants that we could create an association out in the Galbraiths. Now, could we develop that, right? And that's where the business development piece of it is really important. So I think it's important for us to look at what you folks are doing, because on another level, agriculture seems to be a very cooperative industry, right? Everyone needs water. The infrastructure is the shared resource, and government can play a part in it, but certainly the users also need to be involved in it as well. So as these MOAs, I think the last MOA is through 2035. I forget now. But what is the process that you folks go through with ADC to update these? And is it a conversation that happens? Is there a process that you follow? And I know that you folks just recently updated this one, so it may be something that you won't have to do for a while.
It's I guess it's a process we make up as we go, right? Because it's the first agreement that we're aware of, sort of its type, for the purpose, for which we've used it. And every time we discover issues, we're generally discovering them for the first time, at least with respect to ADC and our operations. We're not aware that there's even a similar situation, existing elsewhere in the state. So it generally just starts with a conversation, and that conversation is ongoing between the KA and the ADC on, hey, what's working well? What do we think we could improve on? How do we think we can change the way we work together to be even more effective? And almost on at least recently, I say recently, maybe past 10 years, it's been sort of issue driven, right? When an issue pops up, then we have to figure out, well, it's the first time we're dealing with this, so how do we deal with that? And then the next issue pops up, and okay, this is the first time we're dealing with that, how do we deal with this? And so we haven't yet gone through a whole cycle where it's like, okay, this is exactly like what we did last time, we know how to deal with that. So we're sort of making that up as we go, and having these discussions about how do we think, okay, let's take a step back. What are the long-term objectives? Where do we think we are with respect to some of these, mid-progress sort of projects that we're working on? And so within that context, what do we think we should do for this issue, and how do we think that best helps us going forward? That's sort of the discussion that we have every time.
Okay, and then I'll ask one last question, and then I'm sure I will promise I'll pass it back to Rep. Hashem if he's still there. I guess, KAA is very much involved in ADC being able to manage the settlement agreements with for the Clean Water Act. So can you speak to how how that works. I don't necessarily want to get into any kind of conversation about, are all the settlement agreements being met, because we're in the middle of that, right? But KAA does in fact play a role in ensuring that ADC is meeting its goals. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. There's a sort of a more formal component, and again, Mike can get into some of these details if necessary. And that would be, things that pertain to the operations of the KAA directly. So there are requirements for best management practices related to how we maintain the drainage canal system. We've looked at issues like, okay, taking a step back, aside from these technical specific requirements, there's the broader issue of managing sediment that's coming through the system, irrespective of where it comes from. Should we potentially set aside an area to capture the sediment with a standing water basin of some kind, restore wetland in an area maybe for that purpose? So we have those discussions. We've just recently completed a study on what that might look like. So that's an area that's directly within the KAA sort of jurisdiction. The other somewhat less formal area would be where, as Mike said, we're all in the same boat. We got to cooperate. So the KAA sort of will tap people on the shoulder and say, hey, I think we haven't had to do that as the KAA, thankfully, yet, but would do if we saw that a tenant was, not following the requirements. Probably we'd say, hey, you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z. We're seeing that that's not happening. Can you go do that? That's not actually required of the KAA. That's not really the KAA's role, but sometimes we've done that as an association just to sort of remind people of what their responsibilities are. So.
Yeah. And so just for the education of this committee, right? ADC is responsible for ensuring that the state acquires the NPDES permit and is in compliance with that process. But part of having that permit is ensuring that all the users of the land and the water are complying with best management practices. And that's where you folks come in, and that's how this is a cooperative. So really, you are helping ADC and the state meet its obligations to meet its permit requirements. Okay. And so I think, again, as we move forward in the development of other agribusiness corporate areas in the state, that is a model that actually makes a lot of sense and works, where we don't necessarily need to have, it's not state employees managing these vast lands. It's really a partnership. And this is where the public-private partnership comes in, right? It's you as our partners who are making sure that we're meeting and all of our obligations that makes this possible. And a side really great benefit is hopefully we're protecting our environment so that we have clean waters for people to recreate in, right? And so, sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now, but that I think I really, because that's one of the things that I'm struggling with to understand. How do we get practices in place, models in place so that we are having productive lands where the state may not necessarily be obligated to have to pay for every employee, right? That's not the business we want to be in. We want the farmers to farm and do it within the laws. So with enough of that, Rep. Hashem, any more questions from you on anything for Mr. Uehara or Mr. Faya? And if there aren't any, we'll go to Rep. Kobayashi.
No questions, Rep.
Rep. Tarnas?
We're at 3 o'clock, so I don't want to keep our guests longer.
If you have questions, I think they're okay. So
okay, let me just ask. You just went through a strategic planning process. We're trying to help to support ADC go through their strategic planning process. Would you have benefited from additional information from ADC to help you do your strategic plan?
I think because of the fact that we have ongoing discussions, we were able to get, a lot of the information that we needed from ADC, or even include their input in our plan based on the discussions we have with them. So I think we've been fortunate enough, and they've been accessible, enough to us that we've been able to take care of that.
Okay, great. And then how about your relationship with the Department of Agriculture? Do you have any programs with them? Are you working with them at all? I mean, clearly they've got their regulatory responsibility that they carry out. But do you have any, collaborative effort going on with the Department of Ag?
Yeah, and the Department of Ag has been generally very helpful for us as well. Setting aside the regulatory functions, which they have to do what they have to do. We've been able to have strategic discussions with the department on what do we think might be helpful. When Scott was chair, as well as with current chair Shimabukuro, we've been able to have those types of discussions on what are the challenges for small farmers, for example, with the ag loan program, and are there things that they can help with, or are there have been various grant programs that have gone through Department of Ag, and we've had discussion, are those appropriate potentially for farmers, or even potentially upcoming legislation on, say, like the IL tax credit renewal, and which the KA we're pursuing designation of actually the state property as IL in the area because of the length of some of the infrastructure investments we need to make. And so if we're able to do that successfully, which we're hopeful we'll be able to do that soon, then things like that tax credit would be very, very helpful for developing even state infrastructure. So those are the kinds of discussions we'll have with the Department of Ag, on long-term infrastructure development, legislative issues, other issues under their purview, whether it's the data, as Scott mentioned, or things like that. So yes, definitely. It's it may be ADC property, but because it's agriculture in the end, we definitely work with Department of Ag.
Okay, all right, that's great. And I guess as we look forward, the ADC's next steps with meeting the requirements of MPDES permit, they'll have to have a variety of different monitoring stations in different places. I'm not sure whether or not they're going to be looking to you for any assistance in that monitoring, or if there's been any discussion about that. I don't know if you can comment on it.
It's actually ongoing, and you want to?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. The controversy with the Clean Water Act came up when the former NPDES permits expired, and there was some confusion on whether or not we really needed an NPDES, and then it went to the court, and et cetera, et cetera. But just so you know, we've been, or ADC has been continually testing or taking the samples from the original NPDES requirements, and they've been sending in, but they haven't been distributed to the Department of Health. It's kind of contained within the ADC. With the settlement agreement, there's a 2-year testing period or sampling period, and with 16 sites, I think, dry sites, wet sites, all around the property. And this is another one of those collaborative things. It was a contract that ADC negotiated under this, as a result of the settlement. And then we're helping them on the ground, help them locate, work with the various parties of the settlement where they kind of wanted sampling sites, and then we assisted them with the actual locations of what was actually practical or safe to even get there during a storm event. They just came in on Monday and took some additional samples. Kind of interesting, testing facilities in the state of Hawaii are they're not that many, and so some of the samples got to go all the way to the mainland. We've been having a little bit of a challenge from picking up a sample in the Polihali area, getting it through the dirt roads, back to an airplane, back to Honolulu, through Honolulu traffic, and then into the lab within a 6-hour,
That is hard.
period.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, it's ongoing, and we're expecting it to continue, and we continue working with both the state's contractor, Cardinal, and the DOH and ADC on these issues.
Well, I appreciate the collaborative effort. I mean, we're all trying to do the right thing here, so I appreciate the collaborative effort. Thank you.
In fact, Cardinal has their freezer, we're talk about the collaboration. They have the freezer at one of our shops. They get the ice packs from one of our tenants, the shrimp people, because they've got cases and cases of it. And everybody builds each other and share our manpower resources and often vehicles to get them to places. Anyway, it's just part of, I think what we do in managing the property.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Great. Thanks very much for those responses. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Any final questions from you, Rep. Kobayashi? I'm like losing my place on my list. Any final questions, and we'll wrap up?
No, Rep.
Okay, Rep. Hashem or Rep. Yamashita, and then Rep. Perruso. Go ahead, Rep. Perruso.
Okay, so one final question, and it has to do with, over the course of these hearings, we've been having multiple conversations about the license agreements and the need to modify the license agreements in a couple of different ways, but most importantly around the call for remediation. So either like looking towards an EA phase 1 analysis at the very least, but then also calling for remediation if necessary. So when we talk about the need to change those license agreements and then maybe like going back to revisit that issue with current tenants, do you think that the leadership of KAA would find itself in a kind of conflicted position? Because on one hand, you're asked to manage the co-op and look out for its long-term interests. And on the other hand, you're also a participant. You're one of the anchor tenants, or all of you are, members. So how, can you talk a little bit about that? Or if you've been paying attention to these hearings, like what your thoughts are on revisiting those license agreements for that purpose?
So generally, when it comes to individual member license agreements, that's not something that KAA has decision-making authority over. Typically what would happen would be ADC would come to the KAA as part of its process to evaluate potential new licenses or maybe modifications to a license where they think the KAA is appropriate, to provide input in terms of, is this a type of operation the infrastructure can support in this area or that type of issue. So, if the ADC were to want to add provisions to a license through either modification or build that into a license renewal or extension, that let's say, whatever it may be, might be onerous to the current tenant, that's not something the KAA would be in a position to veto or anything like that. That would just be between the ADC and that particular tenant.
Okay, that's great to understand. Thank you so much.
Rep. Ichiyama? No. One final question sort of on this issue, and because we've come to learn that anchor tenants are so important to your business model, again, some of the public articles that we were reading or that I read that kind of like sparked my this is a red flag was when we saw that acreage was going to be abandoned by some of your anchor tenants. Does KAA have any plans should you lose an anchor tenant? I mean, that must be a kind of outside chance, but with the way the global economy is, that you do have some of your, I don't know if BASF.
Yep, BASF.
Yep. BASF. I don't know if they are an anchor tenant, but they certainly seem like a bigger operation that would have been contributing to. Are they part of KAA?
Not anymore. So they were. And then they left. Bex bought their operations, and now Bex is, essentially on the way out. And actually, this is something that the KA's been dealing with from very early on in its history. So, again, Robinson at one point had sugar operations, also on the ADC property, and were an anchor tenant, and they're signatory to, some of our initial documents, which you'll see. And at some point they decided to exit that, on their way to exiting sugar in general. So it's and that issue is actually part of the reason we realized we needed something like the KAA. You need this organization that sort of mediates between the ultimately probably transitory tenancy of any particular tenant, whether they're an anchor tenant or not, and the sort of duration mismatch in some of the issues that we deal with. Like Mike said, we have 50-year investments in the hydropower or the ditch system that need to be taken care of today by tenants that may not be here in 10 years or, let alone 50 years. But they need that done today for them to continue even for the next 10 and for the property to be in any shape for someone else to come in, as that churn continues. So I think it's something, I don't know if I would call it I guess it's a concern, but it's a fact of life. I think that we realize in ag as in most other industries, change is the only constant. So that's something that we constantly think about. How are we going to deal with that? How do we make sure that the property is prepared for that? How do we make sure the remaining tenants at any one time can, deal with that issue? And sure, there are going to be difficulties depending on, which member at what time, et cetera. But that's part of the core, mission for the KA is to figure out how do you continue forward through those things.
So over time, you've actually, through the association's processes and practices, accommodate and plan for those eventualities and hope that they don't happen. But if they do happen, you do have those contingencies.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. If there's no further questions, this has been very enlightening to learn more about how the operations of Kauai work and how ADC interacts with you folks. Thank you very much for spending your time with us. My hope is that we don't have to recall you back. That's why I kept you a little bit later than 3 o'clock, so my apologies. But with that, we are done and concluded with our hearings with this portion. Members, I will be issuing a notice for hearings with BLNR board members for Monday, November 29th in the afternoon. So please be on the lookout for those hearing notices. And until then, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.